In the dawning of the Raj, it seemed very simple and very good. The British ordered the rhythm of a continent. The horror of the Indian Mutiny of 1857 was over, and the British now chose to withdraw from the life around them. The Indians' chief contact with the ordinary British was as servants. The Indians survived with a minimum of interference from their rulers. For the British, the Raj meant order in the midst of apparent chaos. It meant a blind eye to the filth and poverty that seemingly could not be cured. It meant a standard of living few would have enjoyed in Britain, but it also meant exile in an alien land. The Raj meant pride of achievement. Trains transported halfway across the world to unify a subcontinent. It meant, too, the imminence of death, from tropical disease or casual violence, even on a day of imperial triumph. The Raj meant a ceaseless vigilance and a basic mistrust of India, a need for continual and clear demonstration of British power. It meant constant war with the heat, the need to employ a special servant to wet the blinds and cool the air. In 1889, a great viceroy, Lord Curzon, said, "No one is an Englishman who has not been to India. It is a vast mystery, a prodigious experiment, a genuine glory."
Morning, Martin.
The Raj meant a sort of imperial pride that the British allowed themselves nowhere else, at least on this scale. The British began to celebrate in stone and bronze the idea that they ruled with impartial justice a grateful and picturesque people. The British in India created a new sort of relationship between rulers and ruled. They did not doubt their right to rule, and their remoteness inspired a wonder, even affection. In 1877, at a great ceremony in Delhi, assembled dignitaries heard Queen Victoria proclaimed Empress of India. Victoria believed profoundly that Britain's mission in India was to protect the poor natives and advance civilization. At court in London, she rebuked a minister who'd referred to Indians as black men. In the British press, the ghost of the Indian mutineer, whose revolt 20 years before had nearly driven the British into the sea, was finally laid to rest. The Residency at Lucknow, scene of an epic siege in the mutiny, was now a place of Victorian pilgrimage. The British were commemorating not only their own dead, but those Indians who had fought so loyally beside them. This, indeed, was confidence. This majestic confidence expressed itself in a heavy weight of buildings. They were there as the outward forms of the new pride. Commerce built palaces to express its prosperity and boundless ambition.
Darjeeling and Himalaya debenture 89.5. Rohill Kund debenture 101.5. Bombay, Baroda and Central India Railway.
There seemed no limit to what the British could and would achieve in India. Every architectural style was enlisted in the imperial service. Classical, Gothic, all were used to awe and to celebrate And justly, some of the most tremendous of the British temples were railway stations, like this one in Bombay. For the British in India were practical under their pride. These, like the triumphal arches of Rome, were political, almost philosophical statements.
Chained at Allahabad for Kanpur, Lucknow Junction and Delhi.
Indians marched in the new cause. The British introduced the cultivation of tea into the subcontinent. It was a sound investment which gave dividends to London and employment to the natives. Before, Britain's tea had come from China, purchased by the old East India Company in exchange for Indian opium. When the company lost its tea monopoly in China, it tried to grow it in India. Tea was first cultivated in Assam, in the north, then spread across the land and over to Ceylon. By the turn of the century, the India of the Raj was the world's greatest producer of tea. Life for the plantation owners was often lonely. A young manager served a 13-year apprenticeship. It was harsh for the workers too. Bound by long contracts, they could be arrested if they tried to leave. But tea was an efficient industry. Tea was an industrial rather than peasant agriculture. The planters paid regular wages and spent a lifetime alternately stroking or knocking their workers' heads together to get the product to market. The labour was cheap. It had to be. Tea and bread were the mainstay of the diet for the poor in Britain's growing industrial cities. If tea wasn't cheap, they couldn't afford it. And it was carried from field to factory and later to ship at a special imperial pace that gave in 1,000 trades at least the air of haste in the service of demanding strangers. Tea production was a rapid process, so the planters worked hard to keep everyone on the move. It took barely more than a day through a process of withering, fermentation and drying to turn the green leaf into tea, once the heat was on. The British developed many different grades of tea. The good tea went to Europe, the best to Britain, the broad-leafed roughage to the Arab sheikdoms.
John Keel, 56.
And tea blending and selecting demanded as much expertise as wine.
Little disappointing. Palmer.
The tea tasters were trained for 3 years in Britain before going out to preside over the imperial selection.
John Keel, 82.
Tasters learned to distinguish between tea that was bold, choppy, brisk, fruity, rasping, muddy, mushy, pungent, or mature. The destination was chosen accordingly. Tea changed the social habits of millions. The British had planted wealth in India's soil. They now used the local earth crushers in a road-building program to make still greater trade possible within India. task forces under British engineers hacked roads out of mountains and forests. One of the great builders, Alex Taylor, was only 24. He had charge of 60,000 men and an army of elephants. He supervised building over an area 4 times the size of Scotland, and he went blind in the Indian sun. Still, the British battled on. But the finest British achievement was the Grand Trunk Road, 1,500 miles long, linking Calcutta in the east with the northwest frontier. It took 40 years to complete and was one of the greatest feats of its kind since the Roman Empire. It was something for the British to be proud of. But the great physical achievement in India was the railway. The first steam engine had to be towed by the elephants it would one day make redundant. But by 1880, there were already 9,000 miles of track built across and through mountains after overcoming apparently impossible engineering problems. Railway building took a fearful human toll. 10,000 workers died of cholera building one line alone. The railway did more than anything to change India. It ended the isolation of many towns and villages. It cracked open a compartmented continent, and it forced the castes occasionally to mix.
Change the Rawalpindi cantonment for Peshawar cantonment. Yes, please.
Operating the railway was a preserve of the Eurasian community. By 1870, the travel agent Thomas Cook was running India's first railway tours for Muslim pilgrims en route to Mecca. The railway was proving the most persuasive advocate for westernization ever known in the East. From Ceylon to the Himalayas, the iron bullock resolved many needs. In India, rapid expansion of the network soon made the railway the largest employer in the country. The railway carried the produce of the interior to the coast. Special lines were also built and run uneconomically to speed supplies to the starving during famines. But the railway scaled not only the heights of commerce and compassion. Rails were also laid, like Roman roads, to serve the strategic purposes of the Raj. Advancing into the northwest frontier, the railway reminded the troublesome tribes that British troops would now never be more than a swift rail journey away. The railway helped to make India a nation. But despite all efforts, it was a nation the Raj was never consistently able to feed. Whilst there was always enough grain somewhere in India to feed everyone, the problem was one of distribution. The railway helped, but feeding India was a challenge that fired another sort of engineering. Where the land was irrigated, the inevitability of famine could be reduced. The British built many canals, many dams. By 1903, they had irrigated 20 million acres. Attempts at irrigation were as old as India itself. The British strengthened the ancient canals, changed the course of great rivers, and dug vast new networks of waterways that gave Indians a chance to guard against periodic famines, as well as providing a convenient passageway between towns. Irrigation couldn't possibly solve all the problems. In 1880, the British introduced a famine code to provide relief works in stricken areas with free food and medical aid. During one famine, 1 million Indians worked on a single dam so they could earn enough to live. It was a rare recognition by a colonial government of responsibility for the welfare of its native subjects. Despite this, 19 million Indians died of famine in the quarter century after Victoria was crowned Queen Empress. The waterways were the symbol of an obligation to save life, but they weren't entirely philanthropic. Canal dues brought British investors a guaranteed 7% profit. Thanks to irrigation, part of the Punjab, once barren land, became the Garden of India. The population of this area increased 100-fold under the Raj. One of the new towns, Lyallpur, bears the name of canal pioneer James Lyall. While Britons gave their names to Indian towns, Indian words found their way into the English language. Bungalow, veranda, sandals. These words were born in Hindi, Bengali, Sanskrit, just 3 of the hundreds of tongues of the Indian subcontinent. Words carried across the world by one of the many currents of the imperial stream. Scattered through the English dictionary are other words which remind us of our forebears' experience in the Indian sun. Like pyjamas, the Hindi word for leg clothing. Like tiffin, cheroot, curry and mulligatawny, pucka, gymkhana and bazaar. Like jungle, which confronted the pioneers. Like loot, picked up by British soldiers in the early battles for empire. Like shampoo, which comes from the Hindi word champo, meaning massage. Or like dinghy, from the Hindi word for a small rowing boat. As the Queen's peace bathed India in its imperial glow, more and more Britons were travelling half across the world, drawn by what was now the brightest jewel in the empire. To service the lifeline which carried the imperial servants, British installations sprang up along the sea lanes to India. Imperial lighthouse inspectors kept then as now a firm eye on the string of beacons that shielded the coast of the subcontinent. Once the passage to India had been as hazardous as a crusade. The journey round the tip of Africa could take as long as a year. The more direct overland route through Egypt meant a jolting ride over the desert between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Now, British achievements shone over the maritime scene. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, was now in British hands. Supremacy at sea was backed by technology. By 1900, faster steamships made India only 15 days away. British ships bound for India were guided by no less than 11 British-operated lighthouses along the route. Dotted along the shores of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, on the passage to India, were 8 British coaling stations, 8 British cable stations and ports operated by British engineers to the usual exacting standard.
Good, that looks nice and clean, well done. Right.
The greatest comfort for travellers lay in the knowledge that 2 out of every 3 ships plying the seas flew the British flag. The atmosphere of India, British India, was to greet the traveller the moment he boarded his ship in Britain. The memory of that first journey would be remembered ever afterwards with indestructible nostalgia. To go to India could be an act of duty. It could be a great adventure. The P&O was called the Exiles Line, the vein that served the Empire with young blood. It was the scene of intolerable and final partings. The P&O was also known as the Fishing Fleet because of the many unattached girls who sailed on it, hoping to find a husband. Once at sea, the curious education of the young imperialists began. For the first time, they encountered the natives, Indian seamen who did most of the hard labor on board ship. At sea, too, the British began to experience that disregard for privacy that marked the East. Isolation in the middle of a crowd, the loneliness which was to be one of the greatest hardships in India. It was even more unsettling for the women. The Memsahib's reactions to India were often shaped on the voyage out. They soon hardened themselves, coming to regard the natives as non-persons. The P&O, too, brought a word into the language. Posh, the initials for port out, starboard home, the cooler side of the ship and where the cabins were booked by the better off. Mealtime was a foretaste of the life ahead in a cantonment town, regulated by the bugle from the British lines. The waiters were Indians from outside the Queen's dominion, Christians from the Portuguese colony of Goa. They were recruited as waiters because, unlike Hindus or Muslims, they suffered no religious taboos on handling such foods as beef or pork. Theirs was a service of speed and devotion without equal in Europe. Passengers were fed prodigiously. The menu offered a choice of 17 main dishes, from stewed pig's trotters to sheep's head. To meet the demand for fresh meat, live cattle were carried aboard. People always complained of the smell. There were even free drinks until that was stopped by the temperance movement. Journeys were still not without hazard, but the Raj bred a special stoicism. A lady survivor wrote to a friend, "If you are shipwrecked, my dearest Laura, do contrive to get the catastrophe conducted by the P&O. Our wreck was one of the most agreeable picnics you can imagine." On the voyage, as at home, and as they were to do in India, the Victorians found comfort in the public affirmation of their faith. Women travelling alone to the east were advised to remain in their cabin reading the Bible, to avoid the moral peril that lurked in hot climes. But the Exiles Line was not called the Fishing Fleet for nothing. The best catch was still a member of the prestigious Indian Civil Service, the cream of the British in India. But if you couldn't catch a civilian, you might snare a soldier. But the Orient wasn't all romance. Under the Raj, the Memsahib lived a life of sweaty unreality. She could expect a troop of servants. If she were enlightened, she would instruct them kindly as if they were ignorant children. If not, she left them to run the house on their own and complained bitterly when things went wrong. Complaints about the servants, gossip, paying calls, feeding on the petty jealousies of a tiny expatriate society. This was the Memsahib's life. The Memsahib's presence increased the sense of moral purpose and integrity which the Indians admired in the British, as well as the insufferable arrogance and superiority which they silently hated. The only real breach in the racial barrier was made by the Indians' adoration of children. British mothers handed over their children to Indian nannies while they themselves dreamed of home. Racial feelings ran deep. India after 1870 had many native magistrates. In the cities they had the right to try Europeans, but a government proposal in 1883 to extend this right to the countryside met with fierce opposition from the British in India, particularly the planters, who feared that native judges might support the workers against their masters. The proposal had to be abandoned. Substantial legal equality had been extended to the natives, but social inequality could not be removed by law. The British editor of a newspaper in India asked what justice a Briton could expect from a copper-coloured pagan. The best way for an Indian to be accepted, not socially, but as a decent person, was to adopt British ways. When cricket was first introduced to India, astonished Indians had asked, "Why do you English run around in this terrific heat?" But Indians soon became rather good at the imperial game. It was all right for Indians to play British games, but not to ask for British political institutions. Nevertheless, some did, and voiced their demands at the first meeting of the Indian National Congress in 1885. But to the British, this hardly seemed cricket. With similar enthusiasm, the British adopted Indian sports. When someone as elevated as the Viceroy came to hunt, the Indian found all his roads miraculously repaired. Indeed, the whole region benefited, for every man-eating tiger killed meant that a few Indian peasants survived. But the enjoyable moments of the Raj were dearly paid for. Death seemed to haunt the British on the subcontinent. Major Rogers was a hunter. Having killed 1,400 elephants, he was struck by lightning. After his burial, lightning also struck his tomb. It was said by the cynics that a Briton died one day, was buried the next, had his goods sold on the third, and was forgotten on the fourth. The cemeteries of the Raj record few deaths from old age. Even in the late 19th century, a young man going to India halved his life expectancy. India was particularly cruel to European children. The country had a whole battery of endemic diseases which did not discriminate between the races. Cholera, the scourge of the old East India Company, continued to exact a fearful toll. It was said a British soldier would always try to grab the lowest bunk in any barrack room, for there was an old superstition that cholera was a pestilential cloud that swirled at waist level above the land. If the British soldier escaped disease, he faced a life where temptations abounded. For a while, the British Army in India ran its own brothels for the troops. But when Queen Victoria heard of this, she ordered them to be closed. Uncontrolled prostitution flourished around the great barracks. Liaisons with native women had aroused little criticism before the mutiny. Now it was a very different matter. Few young empire builders dared to marry, far less live with, even a respectable Indian woman. The morality of the Memsahib reigned supreme. It was thought eccentric to take a serious interest in Indian attitudes to love. Even more eccentric to combine this interest with the routine of military life. An old India hand, Richard Burton, once wrote an army manual on bayoneting. He was also a keen Orientalist and made the first translation of the Kama Sutra. Such interest was rare. Most British in India were baffled by the entirely alien Indian concepts of virtue and sin. To the British, the Indian exaltation of sex was a sign of heathen degradation. The love temples were regarded as bestial, the sultry and ugly breath of oriental passion petrified into lascivious stone. This, not Richard Burton's, was the authentic response of the Raj. The British had succeeded in converting many hundreds of thousands of Indians to Christianity. The converts were mainly among the lower classes. The missionaries did many good works in education, in social welfare, but the rulers of India did not really approve. The missionaries might excite the masses to another mutiny. The government even considered banning the Salvation Army. But the British still evoked God's aid in shouldering the white man's burden, that heavy load imposed by the new secular faith of the Victorians in India, duty and sacrifice. That faith's most devoted disciple was the British district officer, the D.O. Every day, except Sunday, the people of his district came to him to air their problems, to have their disputes settled. The best D.O. was like a father to his people. The D.O. was often on the move, the representative of the Indian civil service, the government's man on the spot. He might have charge of nearly 1 million people in one of British India's 400 districts. The D.O. was a one-man local government. He supervised famine relief, checked weights and measures. He collected taxes. Of all the representatives of the Raj, the D.O. came nearest to being universally respected. After the mutiny, the British brought all the strands of Indian law together, and the D.O. sat in judgment. For the official touring his district, all the sportsmen in camp, London stores offered a variety of field equipment. The position of district officer was created after the mutiny, so the British would know what the natives were thinking. The D.O. was therefore expected to be out and about. He could take his home comforts with him. There were gadgets to cool the imperial palate. There were hats to ward off sunstroke or impress the natives. There was an equal range of military apparel, proudly worn, impressive. In 1898, one-third of the entire British Army was stationed in India, in addition to the Indian Army itself. This large military presence dated from the mutiny, but another reason now was to police the northwest frontier, whose tribes warred continually and joyously with each other. In Jamrud, the gateway to the Khyber Pass, homemade guns were sold, and still are, in the general store. The 3 million Pathan tribesmen had never submitted to Britain's authority, or, for that matter, anyone else's. Beyond these hills lay Afghanistan, and beyond it, Russia. Statesmen like Disraeli were convinced that Russia had designs on India, so the British stood guard in the Khyber forts. The Khyber was the main gateway to India. To the south lay the rich prize of the endless Indian plain. Many foreign invaders had come this way before. The pass and the mountains around were vital to the Raj. The Pathan's idea of an even battle was when the odds were heavily in his favour. The Khyber was ideal sniper country. But in India, the military did things in style. Under General Lord Roberts, for 7 years the commander-in-chief in India, the frontier became a kind of giant Aldershot, an ideal training ground for the British Army, with the advantage of live target practice. In Jubilee year 1897, the Khyber Hills echoed to the fire of no fewer than 40 skirmishes with the tribes. In the face of the tribesmen's guerrilla tactics, the British relied on their weight of firepower to keep heads down and the frontier forts secure. After the battle, the enemy vanished into the hills. Death came to many a British soldier cut off from his regiment, stalked like an animal in such a place as this. Kipling saw the tragic wastes of these little border wars. In his poem, Arithmetic on the Frontier, he laments the death of a young British officer. A scrimmage in a border station, a canter down some dark defile. £2,000 of education drops to a 10-rupee Jezail. The crammer's boast, the squadron's pride, shot like a rabbit in a rye. From the Khyber forts, literal outposts of the British Empire, news of victory, frustration or death went from post to post by heliograph. The heliograph had one great advantage over the telegraph. Working off the sun, it had no wires to slash, no wooden posts to be hacked down by ungrateful tribesmen. And on a clear day, the Morse flashes might be read almost 100 miles away. It was an eye for an eye on the frontier. The tribes were confined to what were known as restricted areas. When they raided into the plains, the British punished their villages. When the Pathans had had enough, they'd parley with the British and make a treaty. But the treaties lasted only as long as the life of the tribal chief. Between 1894 and 1899, nearly £1 million a year was spent defending the frontier. The tribes never really gave in. The Russians never came. But around the regiments that served on the frontier, a great legend grew up of action and heroism which enthralled an empire. Distinction could also be won in government work and gossiped about at the many official receptions. Every government servant had an official title. There was the gentleman known as the Inspector of Steam Boilers and Prime Movers, the Sub-Opium Agent for Bihar, and the Examiner of Questioned Documents. Order of precedence was strict, and it was a triumph for the junior Mem Sahib to be invited to a viceroy's party. Every summer, the government of India, led by the viceroy, escaped from the heat of the plains to Simla in the Himalayan foothills. Officials, files, clerks, thousands of Indian servants all made the annual pilgrimage to the hills. Sometimes the town was isolated by storms, the government cut off from the land it ruled. Simla, said one visitor, was like an English watering place gone mad. Sometimes it wore an aura of sanctity. Prayer meetings were held in private houses. In 1877, the Viceroy, Lord Lytton, complained, "I wish I could report our empire is as well defended as our piety." More often, Simla was a hothouse of gossip and excitement. The Viceroy once had to stop the German and Russian consuls from fighting a duel on his tennis court. Simla's own poet laureate composed eulogies in celebration of victories at sport. To one observer, it was all duty and red tape, tempered by picnics and adultery. But the Simla air was so healthy that a French visitor reported, "Everybody has the rosiest of complexions, and the cheeks of the young ladies absolutely invited kisses." Towering over India like Simla itself was the person of the Viceroy. His position was unique. During his 5 years in office, he was bowed and curtsied to, flattered and obeyed. A god in his own heaven. In Simla, he resided at Viceregal Lodge. Viceroys were always complaining that their salary and expenses, over £70,000 in 1900, were not enough. All those house guests, those official parties. Viceregal Lodge needed 200 servants, not counting 100 Indian cooks in the kitchens. When a French chef was imported to take charge, he had a nervous breakdown and had to be sent home. Viceroys, like lesser mortals, could be good, bad, or indifferent. Lord Ripon had been one of those who brought the wrath of the British down upon his head by trying to improve the status of Indians. It was he who had tried to extend the jurisdiction of Indian magistrates. But perhaps the most spectacular British Viceroy was George Nathaniel Curzon. Lord Curzon was brilliant and arrogant. Many British politicians were delighted to wave him off to India in 1898. There he found intolerable lethargy. The administration in India he likened to a quagmire in which questions of high policy sank without trace. Unless, he said, you stick a peg with a label over the spot, you'll never see anything of them again. Curzon's first wife was an American. Her Chicago meat fortune helped him to meet the expenses of empire. Curzon's imperial vision was peculiarly clear-sighted for the time. He insisted the Raj must be seen to be incorruptible, impartial and magnificent. Indians, he believed, needed the idea and reality of kingship as a focus for their loyalty. So he behaved with an ostentatious splendor never seen before in the Raj. He travelled all over India, and his staff ensured that there was always a triumphal arch to mark his progress. Curzon was so intent on even-handed justice that his British subordinates suffered more from it than Indians. His administrative reforms were thorough, effective, and long-lasting. Curzon's engrossing interest in India led him to undertake the restoration of the Taj Mahal and other great monuments of Mughal times. He wanted Indians to be proud of their past and also their present. Referring to a former Indian ruler, Curzon said, "The Emperor Ashoka has spoken to posterity for 2,200 years through his inscriptions on rock and stone. Why should not Queen Victoria do the same?" And he planned this building to commemorate in Calcutta the greatest of all India's rulers, the British. Dotted around the statue of the Queen Empress were effigies of the great men who had represented Britain in India for a century. The only Indians whom Curzon treated with any degree of equality were the 562 native princes. Their states covered 2/5 of India and were under British influence. They were an essential buttress of the edifice of empire. The princes were granted British honours and titles. They were allowed their own armies and assured of British protection. But if they misbehaved, they could be deposed. Many of the princes were educated in Britain. Many more went to a college the British established in India for the sons of princes. There they could have the same kind of Western education the British were beginning to give the Indian middle classes. The princes feared their hereditary rule might one day be threatened by the Indian middle classes who were given a taste of political power in the British reforms of 1909. So the princes allied themselves still more closely with the British, on whom their position depended. In 1911, they streamed to Delhi to pay homage to the emperor who now ruled India. King George V and his queen had come to Delhi to preside at a great imperial durbar, the most magnificent display of power the British had ever staged.
Highness, the Gaekwar of Baroda. Highness the Jam of Nawanagar, His Highness the Nizam of Hyderabad, His Highness the Maharaja of Bikaner.
After the homage of the princes, the King Emperor moved to a still higher podium to announce the transfer of the capital from Calcutta, founded by the British, to Delhi, the former seat of the Great Mughals. Lord Curzon had once said, "If somewhere among these millions you have left a little happiness or prosperity, a sense of manliness or moral dignity, a spring of patriotism, a dawn of intellectual enlightenment, or a stirring of duty where it did not exist before, that is enough. That is the Englishman's justification in India." At the Durbar were some of the Indians who'd fought for the British in the mutiny more than 50 years before. They were a reminder of the fragility of British rule. The British could not survive in India without the cooperation and consent of India's people. In 1911, the relationship between Britain and India seemed cemented into a foundation that would last forever.